friends, welcome back to Inside Ambition, and thank you for tuning in to the first episode of the Main Report, the weekly Drexel and Philly news rewind so that you don't get left behind. I'm Gabby Remo, and whew, baby, do we have a first show for you. So, Gabby, what are we gonna talk about today? Thank you, Gabby! Today we will be recapping the national news of 2020. We have to, especially when talking about the biggest event of 2020, the coronavirus. I mean, it's physically impossible to talk about 2020 without talking about the global impact of COVID-19. It dominated the year, taking the lives of millions of people, and has become another source of political division in America. I mean, who knew we could make a virus political too? What next? A debate on universal access to the basic human right of healthcare? So glad that's not happening, right? Right, Gabby? Hello? Are you still there? And while I'm alone to my thoughts and before it overtakes me, let's jump right into the timeline. And we're gonna start right from what we know as the beginning. On December 31st, 2019, while everyone and their moms was standing side by side in what is now cringe-worthy close contact in New York City, sharing sweat and swapping spit under the big ol' shiny ball, waiting for its drop, the real ball was dropped when the Wuhan Municipal Health Commission reported their first cluster of cases of pneumonia in Wuhan. At this point, there was no evidence supporting that notion that this unknown virus was spread by humans. No deaths were reported until January 11, when Chinese state media declared the first death linked to the coronavirus. Until then, there was no confirmed cases elsewhere. And that was the world's first glimpse of the violence that is COVID-19. And on January 20th, multiple countries confirmed cases outside of mainland China. This included Japan, Thailand, and South Korea. And back here in the United States, the first confirmed case occurred in Washington. There, a man developed symptoms after returning from a business trip to Wuhan, China. Within 3 days of this, the Chinese government closed Wuhan and restricted travel to and from the city. At this point in time, almost 20 deaths were reported. The World Health Organization convened an emergency committee under the International Health Regulations, IHR 2005, to assess whether to declare this outbreak a public health emergency of global concern. Thousands of new cases were reported in China and across the world by January 30th. Thus, the World Health Organization declared this a global health emergency. Because of this, on January 31st, the Trump administration announced the first in a wave of travel bans. He blocked travel into the United States by any foreign nationals who had traveled to China within 2 weeks. This garnered immediate criticism, some even citing this act as xenophobic. On February 27th, due to concerns over the new approaching pandemic, stocks began to tank. This would begin a rapid decline that resulted in March 9th, Black Monday, being the largest stock market drop since the Great Depression. Who knew we were all about to learn exactly why it was called the Great Depression the first time around? Throughout the month of February, new cases and sadly, new deaths were announced daily across the world. Italy and Iran became global epicenters of the virus and were deeply affected as they experienced saturated outbreaks in their nations. Into March, COVID-19 began to raise heck in the United States. With 130 reported cases and 11 recorded deaths, this was the beginning of a violent, upward slant in cases that would horrify the world over. March 5th saw the US pass the first COVID relief bill, the only one that the government seemed to coordinate on before falling into complete disarray. Somehow, I've been paying twice the bills Congress has been passing on less than half of their salary. But I digress. March 11th was the day that the world began to end, with the WHO officially naming the COVID-19 outbreak a pandemic. It is also the day that Trump instituted another travel ban, this time to most of Western and Central Europe. So I guess we can't see London, can't see France, at least for the time being anyways. March 12th gave us the beginning of shutdowns, with New York instituting the first lockdown procedure. Only one day later, March 13th, Trump officially issued a state of emergency regarding the pandemic, leading to great panic buying and tremendous memes about Karens fighting for toilet paper in aisle 6. And on March 14th, all Drexel students were forced to move online, and all those in student housing were evicted, giving a matter of days to move out. Our community was scrambling to find shelter in the midst of a public health emergency. And by March 17th, every state in the US was touched by COVID-19. And by March 19th, over 280,000 people filed for unemployment. March 21st saw the FDA officially grant nationwide approval for initial rapid testing procedures, which would detect the virus in 45 minutes, thus making it the fastest virus locator since my grandma's home computer. The following day, the first US Senator, Rand Paul, tested positive for the virus, and this terrified US citizens and for some, legitimized this virus. At this point in March, the United States led the world in confirmed cases. By March 26th, the US had 81,321 confirmed infections and more than 1,000 deaths. This was more reported than in any country at that point in time. This also continued to devastate our economy, which led to President Trump signing a $2 trillion stimulus package to help the economy. Our cases and deaths continue to climb, wrapping out the month of March at around 163,000 infected and over 3,000 dead. Because of this, the CDC began advising people to take safety precautions to slow the spread, and stay-at-home orders extended for months, which sparked outrage. Many businesses protests, some hitting national newsstands very close to home. For example, the protest by the Atlas Gym in Belmar, New Jersey, less than 20 minutes outside of Philadelphia. The gym refused to close down during the state's mandated shutdown, and since then have accrued $124,000 in fines. The owners both claim this is just the big bad government taking over control in disguise of a public health crisis, and not a single case of COVID-19 has been linked to their establishment. The anti-lockdown train really started in April of 2020, when United States citizens began protesting the mandated lockdown. These protests were organized predominantly by conservative groups and individuals. The arguments centered around the economic and social impact of stay-at-home orders, business closures, and restriction of personal freedoms. And objectively, they weren't wrong. By April of 2020, 10 million people were out of work, which led to 6.6 million people applying for unemployment. Prior to this, the worst week for unemployment filings was 695,000 in 1982. We were entering a deep economic recession, and at the rate that we were at, economists envisioned a long-term depression. So, that makes 2 depressions I was struggling with. Heyo! The medical community struggled in the beginning of this pandemic, specifically due to a lack of resources. Those battling COVID-19 on the front lines were scrambling to find personal protection equipment, better known as PPE. By April, Drexel heard this call and sprung to action. Our university aided the call by turning their Department of Material Science and the power of 3D printing to produce face shields for several hospitals. We love to see it. On April 14th, Trump decided the world was better off without our help and pulled US funding from the WHO for not sending more aid and resources to the US. Does it sound ironic? I'll let you decide. To wrap up April, Trump signed a bill to help small businesses with all the funds immediately going to businesses that weren't small. And Texas and Florida reopened prematurely, to no one's surprise. The global death toll surpassed 200,000, and more than 2.8 million people worldwide were infected. Countries around the world were entering into recessions, but most leaders felt torn and hopeless. How do you both save your country from economic downfall whilst also maintaining their public health? It was all about prioritization. And by May, Americans were really down. Between February and May, more than 5 million Americans lost health insurance coverage, and over 23 million filed for unemployment. Through the preceding months, the coronavirus ripped through regions, both new and old. In June of 2020, regions like Africa and Latin America, previously not harshly impacted, became victims to this pandemic. Closing up June, Florida and South Carolina broke their single-day records for new cases. Southern states experienced infection levels so high where lockdown, social distancing, and mask restrictions were much less strict. And by July, the United States reported almost 2 million positive cases. The previous monthly high occurred in April, with less than half of the cases being recorded. Florida fulfilled its national duty of being the most nutty state in the US, becoming the new viral epicenter and topping 10,000 cases a day. On August 16th, the CDC began a development plan for the COVID-19 vaccine. They began consulting with large states and cities, one being our home, Philadelphia, to develop plans to distribute that vaccine. The agency chose communities like ours for a pilot program, which is essentially a small-scale experimental trial in the short term that helps the CDC learn how the project may do on a larger scale. In this case, the vaccine and getting it out there. Simultaneously, universities were coming back and some were even attending in-person classes. This was quickly shut down. The University of Notre Dame announced that it would be moving to online instruction for at least 2 weeks in an attempt to slow the spread, as colleges across the nation experienced outbreaks. Temple University experienced a campus shutdown in August. By mid-September, the United States surpassed 200,000 deaths linked to the coronavirus, a figure commonly referenced through the presidential election. And then, it happened. Twitter, Instagram, and fake news Facebook really blew up when this story broke. On October 2nd, President Trump tested positive for the virus. This further sent the political world into a frenzy, as prior to his positive test, he was in attendance at the infamous presidential debate. By the end of October, the US was topping over 100,000 new cases every single day. By November, the US surpassed 10 million infections, and 10 days later, the US death toll hit 250,000. In early December, deliberation over a second relief bill begun, and most resolutions were not fully reached until a few days into the new year. And then, what felt like long-lost hope emerged from the shadows. On December 11th, the Pfizer-BioNTech COVID-19 vaccine was issued emergency authorization by the FDA, opening the gate for its distribution in the US. 7 days later, a second vaccine by Moderna received the same authorization, though in contrast, it's only for individuals 18 years or older. On December 14th, one of the first vaccines was administered in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and Philadelphia soon followed. For some, but not all of us, the distribution of a vaccine finally feels like we are rounding the corner on this horrible disease. And plus, great initiatives have been announced recently, so close to home. On December 15th, Drexel revealed that they are partnering with SEPTA to effectively decrease the spread of the virus on public transportation. This initiative encapsulates more than $600,000 in federal funding in order to develop a new air and surface cleaning technology to improve the safety of riders and employees. Go Dragons! It was a hopeful way to close out 2020 in our community. And now we're here, January 2021. We did it, Joe. In my spirit, I did not know how we were going to make it to 2021, which in reality is a huge blessing. Given the strength of this virus, I'm glad you and I could share these moments together. But the pandemic is far from over. I want to make that very clear. But if we all just try to do what we can to protect ourselves and others, we can soldier through to a better 2021. As in the unforgettable quote from High School Musical goes, we are all in this together. Thank you for tuning in to this week's edition of the Main Report. We hope to see you again soon. For as long as there's news that you will need, I, Gabby Remo, will be there to report it. I'll see you next week.